Welcome back. I want to continue with the Great War, and I think I got us into the war last time. We talked about long-term causes and then those short-term incidences that bring on this catastrophe. I want to talk about the actual fighting for a few minutes on the Western Front primarily. You'll remember the Schlieffen Plan, and it called for this massive flanking attack by the German army through the Low Countries in Belgium, and then sweeping into France from the north, enveloping Paris, and then pinning the French armies against the frontier and destroying them. That's the plan. You'll remember that by invading Belgium, the German army provokes England in declaring war against Germany. So you can see this thing just builds and builds and builds. The Schlieffen Plan did not work. The German army was stopped just outside of Paris. You could hear the Parisians could hear the German artillery in the distance. The combination of the French armies that had maneuvered into position to block the Germans, in cooperation with the British Expeditionary Force that had landed in France. These were able to halt the German advance and push it further to the east so that it had less of a chance of enveloping Paris. So what happens now is that the two massive armies, both the Germans and the Allies, the British and the French, they begin to try to flank one another. And of course this is natural. This is what generals do. If you can flank the enemy, you can drive him out of his position. Sometimes you can even break up his army and win the battle. So I want you to picture this, and you can see the map here of the Western Front. Both the Allies and the Germans begin to try to flank each other. And it ends up becoming a race between these two giant armies as the Allies move to their left, constantly trying to flank the German right, and the German right is constantly trying to flank the Allied left. These two armies race to the English Channel. On the other side, the Swiss Alps protect the Allied right, and they protect the German left. So picture this. You have this massive trench system that's going to develop to protect the infantry from the opposing artillery. And this trench system is going to stretch from the Swiss Alps all the way to the English Channel. The Channel protecting both the Allied left and the German right, and the Alps protecting the Allied right and the German left. This means that neither army can flank the other. So what are the consequences of this? Well, you have, I think I mentioned earlier that the general's tactics never caught up with the technology. So, without the option of flanking the enemy and trying to get into the enemy's rear to break up his lines of communication, to cause havoc and chaos and panic, without that option, the generals on both sides, Allied and German, launched these massive frontal assaults across what we call no man's land. So picture these elaborate trench systems, German and Allied, stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss Alps. And then between these elaborate trench systems, you have this dead zone, literally a dead zone. It's called no man's land. And you can look at pictures of it. You can Google them, or we'll supply you with some pictures. And you can see that once the guns open up, a chicken couldn't live in that territory between the two trench lines. So the generals are launching these massive infantry attacks across no man's land. And of course, these attacks are, for the most part, unsuccessful. So if you wanted to characterize the fighting on the Western Front, you would say it's static. There's very little movement after that first campaigning season in the fall of 1914. It's an immobile type of warfare. It's trench warfare. This is a brutal way of living for these infantry on both sides. I think I remember reading that our first industrial insecticides were created here to try to spray the trenches to relieve the men of the agony of constant flea infestation. You can imagine these trenches after 3 or 4 days of heavy rain The soldiers sloshing through this mess. Their boots rot off, and then their socks rot off, and then their skin rots off. So you have gangrene and infections and amputations. And then, of course, these men are constantly poised to go over the top. That is, to emerge from their trenches and try to make their way across no man's land to assault the enemy trenches. And of course, once you get into no man's land, you have barbed wire and concertina wire, that razor wire that you see. You have artillery, machine guns, and poisonous gas. So your odds of crossing no man's land without being killed or wounded are very slim indeed. And again, this works for both sides. Neither side was ever able to figure out how to solve this tactical problem, the inability to flank the enemy. So we have astronomical casualties unlike anything we've ever seen in warfare, even to today. I suppose the casualties on the Eastern Front in World War II were equally as bad, and perhaps in Japan and China in the Second World War, but the casualties in the First World War are astronomical and would be completely unacceptable today. What else should I talk about here? Let's talk about the Eastern Front for just a bit. Here, the Germans have a great deal more success. It's a much more mobile, fast-moving type of warfare. And the German army gobbles up the western frontier of Russia, the Baltic states. Today, what we would think of as Poland is completely occupied by the Germans. So the whole western frontier of the Tsarist Russian state is occupied by the Germans, and the Germans inflict terrible defeats on the Russians. We'll talk about the Russian Revolution in our next lecture, so you'll get a sense of the futility of the Russian war effort. The Germans will, in fact, sign a treaty with the new government in Russia, led by Vladimir Lenin, the Bolshevik government, or the Russian communist. The Brest-Litovsk Treaty will cede or surrender that whole large swath of Western Russia to Germany. Now, at the end of the war, that treaty will be disavowed and that land redistributed, and we'll talk about that later as well. So when you think of the Western Front, I want you to think of the elaborate trench system stretching from the Alps to the English Channel, the inability to flank, the necessity of these massive frontal assaults backed by artillery barrages. And of course, the artillery barrage that precedes one of these assaults is designed to smash up the enemy's lines, to smash up his trenches, and to render him defenseless. This rarely works. When the artillery barrage starts, the enemy simply crawls down into the trenches and hunkers down, and waits until the barrage ends, and then they reemerge, assume their positions, and destroy the approaching infantry. So, immobile, static warfare. This will be in dramatic contrast to what we'll see 20 years later when the German army puts into practice the Blitzkrieg, lightning war, and the fighting on the Western Front will look quite different. So let's stop there with this characterization of the Western Front and the fighting, and we'll talk about the Versailles Treaty, and we'll talk about the Russian Revolution. Thank you.